Forward. It all began 12,000 years ago. Our world changed, and the reason wasn't nature or chance, but, as ancient myths claim, the gods. Just 12,000 years separate us from the first stone sickles to nuclear power plants and space satellites. But how did it happen? Why did hunter-gatherers, who led a free and well-fed life, suddenly voluntarily abandon it, moving to stuffy, sparsely populated settlements? Modern historians try in vain to explain this transition, citing economic reasons. But the myths of all peoples on Earth unanimously assert agriculture was a gift to people. Not only was knowledge granted, but also tools and even domesticated genetically modified seeds. What if these myths aren't fiction, but an echo of real events? What if someone purposefully and calculatingly hooked humanity on the addiction of agriculture? After all, corn, for example, has no wild forms on Earth and is unable to reproduce without humans. Its kernels are tightly wrapped in leaves, and without our help, they will never be able to fall to the ground and sprout. The Egyptian pyramids, poisonous high-altitude plants transformed into food, and a multitude of other artifacts that have stood the test of millennia confirm there once existed a highly developed civilization that we call gods. And this story is an attempt to understand why these gods acted this way. This is a story about us, about our past, which perhaps is not what it has always been presented as. Chapter 1. The Corn Debate. A cold, heavy evening of wet snow blanketed Seattle. The streetlights on Broadway glowed in blurry yellow patches, barely piercing the veil of soggy snow that looked like noodles. Inside the cozy coffee shop, The Bean, smelling of coffee and old books, three friends were, as usual, arguing about the fate of humanity. Dave, stocky and bearded with a cunning squint, twirled a clay mug in his hands. He was a proponent of official history, though he loved listening to various theories just to tear them apart. So, what are you peddling to me, Leo? This is all nonsense. Where do these gods come from? Fairy tales, stories for people who don't want to use their brains and just believe in a nice legend. The transition to agriculture is a natural process, an economic one, understand? Humanity evolved, grew, and needed more food. That's it. Leo, thin and nervous, with shining eyes, swallowed his tea and adjusted his glasses. He was the complete opposite of Dave, a convinced follower of alternative history. Every new discovery, every inconvenient find, was for him a confirmation that official science was hiding the truth. Economic? He scoffed. Just think about it yourself. It's pure madness. Imagine this. You're a hunter-gatherer. You live free. You move around whenever you feel like it. There's plenty of food, animals, berries, roots. You work 3 or 4 hours a day, and the rest of the time you're free. You're healthy. You don't have problems with neighbors over territory. There are no wars over resources. And suddenly, one fine day, you decide, okay, that's enough of this life. I think I'll settle down in one place. Work this land with sweat, blood, and calluses, and wait for a harvest that might not even come up. And I'll also fight with other settlers like me for a place in the sun. Isn't that absurd? That's an oversimplification, Leo, interjected Peter, the oldest of them. Gray-haired and calm, he was a bridge between the two poles, always seeking a compromise and the truth. You're not taking population growth into account, Leo. When there were more people, resources became scarce. New ways had to be found. But there weren't more people. They lived in harmony with nature, no overpopulation. Why did they need this transition if they were content? Can you explain that to me? They lived like they were in paradise, well-fed, free, without wars, and then, bang, paradise ended. Agriculture appeared along with diseases and conflicts, and all because it was necessary. For whom? To me, it's just a gift from the gods. Dave laughed. "Huh, a gift? And for what? So people would pay them tribute later? What kind of greedy motives have you come up with?" And that's where it gets interesting. Leo leaned in conspiratorially. Remember in our text it mentioned corn? That it can't reproduce without humans? The kernels are tightly wrapped in leaves, and without our help, they will never be able to fall to the ground and sprout. The Egyptian pyramids, poisonous high-altitude plants transformed into food, and a multitude of other artifacts that have stood the test of millennia, confirm there once existed a highly developed civilization that we call gods. And this story is an attempt to understand why these gods acted this way. This is a story about us, about our past, which perhaps is not what it has always been presented as. A few more large, wet snowflakes fell on the table. Peter looked at them, then at his friends. "Yeah, something's not right here," he said quietly. "But this is just the beginning. We need to dig deeper. We need to understand what really happened. Maybe this transition wasn't voluntary." The snow outside kept falling, as if it was burying the traces left in our history. But the friends knew that they would get to the truth no matter what. Chapter 2. Poisonous Gifts. A few days later, the friends met again at the Bean. The snow had stopped, but the world still seemed to be drowned in a milky white haze, and the streetlights squinted with the same blurry yellow eyes. Dave sipped his coffee, watching Leo, who was wound up from the first minute like an old engine. "So tell me, Dave," Leo began, snapping his fingers to get the waiter's attention. "Just tell me, last time we talked about corn, remember? About how it's a genetically modified product that can't reproduce without us. That was one example. What do you have to say about another one?" Dave grunted, not expecting a direct question. "What is it? Tell me." The same text we read mentioned a certain David Brahm, a professor of anthropology. He studied high-altitude regions and discovered that in the deepest antiquity, someone had performed an incredibly complex chemical analysis of poisonous plants. And not just that, they invented a method for removing the poisons so these plants could be eaten. Do you realize that? "So what?" Dave raised an eyebrow skeptically. "It was probably a long process, thousands of years of trial and error. They ate it, got poisoned, died. Didn't eat it, stayed alive. That's logical." "Logical? Are you kidding me?" Leo flared up. "Imagine you're a caveman. You're surrounded by poisonous plants. You're not just going to eat them because you know you'll die. And you certainly aren't going to conduct some kind of chemical analysis. I'm not even talking about the equipment you'd need. You need a methodology, you know. You won't be able to find the right antidote component in another plant. You have neither the knowledge nor the conditions. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack in pitch darkness and then somehow threading it." "The process of accumulating knowledge," Peter said softly. As always, he listened to their argument like a judge hearing both sides. "Maybe they used something like a primitive distillation or filtration." "What distillation? What knowledge?" Leo almost jumped out of his chair. "You realize we're talking about poisons. Where do they get this incredibly complex analysis? This isn't just accumulation. This is something that was given, knowledge that came from outside, and someone passed it on to them." "And you're talking about gods again," Dave sighed. "Leo, don't you think it's too easy? It's simple to blame everything on some mythical figures." "Well, what do you think it should be?" Leo countered, his eyes burning. "The official version doesn't provide any satisfactory explanation. None. It's like someone gave you a black box, and you're trying to explain its functions by pretending you built the box yourself. But you didn't. Someone else created it and just handed it to you, and that black box is us." Dave crossed his arms over his chest. "So why would they do that? Give us poisonous plants and then teach us how to neutralize them? For what?" "To tie us down even more," Leo exclaimed, his voice becoming quieter and more intense. It's part of the same plan as the corn. They gave us dependence on their technologies, on their knowledge. These aren't kind gods, Dave, but very calculating architects. They created a system in which we became their pawns. We stopped being free hunter-gatherers. We became slaves to the land. So these gods intentionally made people transition from freedom to slavery? Exactly, Leo answered triumphantly. First, they gave us genetically modified seeds to tie us to the land. Then, they taught us how to eat what was once poison so we'd depend on their knowledge. Our entire history is a chain of events that systematically led us to our current state of dependence. Dave was silent. For the first time, he couldn't find a counter-argument. Yes, it sounded like madness, but there was a chilling logic to it. He looked at his friends, then at his own hands. He was a descendant of those who were once free, but something forced them to change their way of life. Something that still affects us, their descendants, thousands of years later. And in that moment, they were truly terrified. Because if this was true, what was the next step in this seemingly completed plan? What else did these gods give us? And what did they get in return?
Chapter 3. Stones that live forever. Outside the bean, the evening haze had thickened, and it was completely dark. The garlands lit up, and their colorful lights, reflecting off the wet asphalt, hinted at the approaching holidays. But the friends were not in a festive mood. They were still sitting at their table, and the atmosphere around them was electric. "So, you talk about knowledge and technology," Peter began when there was a pause. He cautiously, as if afraid of breaking a fragile layer of ice, touched upon a new topic. "But what about the physical artifacts? The things that have survived through the millennia? The pyramids, for example. Our text mentions that Egyptian myths speak of knowledge being passed down to people by gods." "That's it!" Leo immediately perked up. "Dave, you're our official historian. Explain it to me. How? How did they do it? Without cranes, without modern tools? Thousands of perfectly fitted blocks, each weighing 200 tons. Did they haul them by hand? How many people would that have taken?"
"Do you know how many people there were in ancient Egypt?" Dave countered. "And you're also forgetting their incredible unity and faith. They weren't building for themselves, but for their pharaoh, who was a god to them. It was a religious, not an economic motivation. They could move those blocks by hand, using ramps and levers."
"Levers?" Leo snorted. "Do you think it's that simple? And how did they fit the blocks together with such precision that you can't even get a razor blade between them? And don't forget the cardinal direction alignment. They've stood for thousands of years. This is incredible technology."
Yes, it was a skill brought to perfection. They evolved, they learned. It didn't happen overnight. I don't understand why you don't believe in the capabilities of ancient people.
"We don't believe. We believe exactly that." Leo threw his hands up. "We believe that ancient people were smart and resourceful, but we don't believe they could have created something like that out of nothing. They couldn't have just invented all of these technologies. Someone passed them on. And that someone was the one the myths talk about, the ones they called gods. But I'm sure it was just a highly advanced civilization, perhaps even human, but one that lived 10 to 15,000 years ago."
"But why did they leave?" Peter interjected. "If they were so advanced, what were they doing here?"
"That's the main question." Leo pulled the sugar bowl closer again. "They left, probably because their mission was completed. They changed the course of our history. They turned us from free hunters into farmers. And then they just left us alone with a new reality, with a dependence on the land, with constant wars over it, with hierarchy, and they left these structures as a symbol of their power, as a reminder. Dave was silent. He imagined it. Hundreds of thousands of people working on a structure that had no practical purpose other than to show the greatness of a ruler, or, if he believed Leo, the greatness of those who stood behind that ruler. "Okay, fine," Dave said, reluctantly agreeing. "Let's say so. But what did they get in return? What was their interest? All of this had to serve some purpose, right?" Leo smiled. "What if they got something more than just material gain? What if they didn't just leave, but stayed, simply disguised themselves and became unseen? What if they're watching us like ants in an anthill? And what if they left us these gifts in the form of technologies so we wouldn't just survive, but evolve according to their plan?" Silence fell. A car drove by outside, splashing dirty slush everywhere. But in the coffee shop, time seemed to stand still. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts. Dave, about how his neat worldview had cracked. Peter, about how everything might be much more complicated than he had thought. And Leo, about how their investigation was just beginning and the main secrets were still ahead. They understood that they hadn't even come close to solving the mystery, but had only approached its threshold.
Chapter 4. Consequences. The friends' next meeting took place the following week. The atmosphere in the Bean was calmer, but tension still hung in the air. The recent arguments had shaken Dave so much that he had begun to look at familiar things differently, doubting every one of his convictions. "I've been thinking," he began, looking at his mug with a chipped edge. "What if you're right? What if it wasn't evolution, but a deliberate transition? What if we really were hooked on agriculture? But why? To control us? That's too simple, Leo." "What's more complex?" Leo retorted. "Imagine you're a manager. You need your resources not to run all over the planet, but to always be at hand, so they don't die from poison, don't starve, so they can be easily counted. What do? You give them a way to tie themselves to the land. You give them domesticated grains like corn. You teach them to use poisonous plants so they have more food and therefore more resources." "But that's terrifying," Peter blurted out. "It looks like an experiment." "That's what I'm saying," Leo nodded. "Think about it. The consequences of this transition, as the text says, were stunning and at the same time tragic. Why tragic? Because we stopped being free. We started fighting over land. Hierarchy and slavery appeared. After all, someone had to farm the land and someone had to rule over it. Someone got power and someone else got dependence. But that also served as a push for the development of civilization." Dave didn't give up. Cities, writing, and science appeared. Without agriculture, we'd still be running around with spears and hunting mammoths. "What's so bad about that?" Leo chuckled. "We'd be living in harmony with nature. There would be no nuclear bombs, no wars over resources, no endless race for luxuries that, in essence, we don't need. We would be happy. In our own way, of course." "Do you think we're unhappy now?" Peter asked. "We're slaves," Leo replied. "Only not to the land, but to money. We work to buy food, clothes, to pay for housing. What did we get in return? We can look out the window and see thousands of people rushing somewhere, not understanding why. We are the product of someone's calculation, someone's plan. So our history, our entire civilization is a mistake in your opinion?" Dave asked quietly. Leo thought about it. "No, not a mistake. It's a result.
the result of someone's will. And now we're reaping the fruits. The consequences of the transition to agriculture, that's us. We are a civilization created not by our own will, but by someone else's calculation. And the most terrifying thing is that we have no idea what that calculation was. They fell silent. Each of them felt as if they were alone with this monstrous thought, and in that moment they understood that their little coffee shop debate had grown into something more than just an intellectual exercise. They were on the threshold of a truth that was both terrifying and fascinating. There was only one step left to find out what was on the other side of that threshold.
Chapter 5. Answers in the Silence. This Saturday, they met at Peter's apartment. The windows of his place looked out onto a snowy square. The soft light of the desk lamp cast long shadows. The friends sat in deep armchairs, and the conversation was quiet, almost a whisper. The tension that had hung between them was replaced by a kind of grim concentration. "So," Peter broke the silence, "we've concluded that agriculture wasn't evolutionary, but purposeful. That it was a gift from a highly advanced civilization we call gods. We've hypothesized that this was done to tie us to the land, to make us dependent. But for what? What was their interest?" Dave looked at him, and there was no longer any skepticism in his eyes, only weariness. Maybe their goal wasn't the land, but us. He clenched his fists. Maybe they didn't need resources, but something else. Us. Our energy. Our enslaved dependence. Leo looked up. "You think we're like batteries or something? That's getting into science fiction, Dave." "But what if it's true?" Dave shook his head. "After all ancient civilizations were obsessed with sacrifices, blood, suffering, tears. Maybe that was the payment. Our energy, which they took." "Nonsense," Leo sharply exhaled. "No science fiction, just facts. Look, our text says that the representatives of this lost civilization, remembered as gods, purposefully sent the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. Purposefully, do you hear? They didn't want us to starve, they wanted us to evolve, but according to their plan." "So why was it so tragic then?" Peter asked. "The most tragic chapters in human history." "Because it was normal for them," Leo exclaimed. "They, perhaps, went through the same thing. Maybe their civilization was also built on slavery, and they decided that this was the only path to progress. They gave us technologies so that we wouldn't just survive, but evolve according to their model. But they didn't account for one thing." "What?" Dave and Peter looked at him. "Something human. A love for freedom, a thirst for free will. We are not slaves by nature, and they made a mistake. They thought everything would go according to their plan, but we, humans, will always strive for freedom. And our entire history is a struggle for that freedom." A long silence followed. The friends had finally found an explanation that suited them all. It wasn't a perfect scientific explanation, but it allowed all the facts to be connected. They understood that history isn't just a collection of dates and names. It's a living organism that breathes and changes, and its roots go back so far into antiquity that we can't even imagine. And who knows, maybe we're still continuing that same experiment today without even realizing it. The history of our civilization is a struggle that began 12,000 years ago, a struggle for freedom, and this struggle is not yet over. And the friends, sitting in the warmth, felt that they were part of this huge, invisible, but so important story. They felt truly terrified, but at the same time, they felt an extraordinary excitement, because if they were right, then the future was in their own hands, and that was the most important thing.